when he was at MIT, but for the past, since 2003, has been a Harvard professor, college professor, and Johnson family professor at Harvard University. He's over again to Bristol. We had him a year ago. Stephen was here promoting his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and now it's out on paperback. And so it will be available at the end of the talk for signings at a reduced price. And the talk tonight is going to be 40 minutes, and followed by about 20 minutes of questioning, Q&A. So without much further ado, would you give a big round of applause for Stephen Pinker?
Thank you, Bruce. Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and today we may be living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence. The decline of violence has not been steady, it has not brought rates of violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. But I hope to persuade you that it is a persistent historical development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from wars and genocides to the treatment of children and animals. I'm going to walk you through 6 major declines of violence, try to identify their immediate causes, that is, particular historical events of the era, and then try to tie them together in terms of their ultimate causes, namely general historical forces interacting with human nature. The first decline of violence I call the pacification process. Until around 6,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy, without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? This is a question that great minds have pondered for centuries. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes famously wrote that in a state of nature, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state. Well, both of these men were speculating from the armchair. Neither of them had any idea what life was like in a state of nature. But today we can do better, because there are 2 sources of evidence on rates of violence in non-state societies. The first is forensic archaeology. You can think of this as CSI Paleolithic. Namely, what proportion of prehistoric remains show signs of violent trauma, like bashed-in skulls, decapitations, arrowheads embedded in bones, or mummies found with ropes around their necks. Here I've put together the 19 estimates that I could find from the literature, and they span quite a range, but they average out at 15%. 15% of prehistoric skeletons show some signs of violent trauma. Let's compare that 15% figure to those of modern states. If we look at the United States and Europe in the 20th century, it comes in at 2/3 of 1%. The world in the 20th century, aiming at the largest defensible estimate that would include the direct deaths from war, the indirect deaths from disease and hunger in the wake of war, and the genocides and man-made famines, gets you up to about 3%. And in the world in the 20th century has a bar that is less than 1 pixel high, representing a violent war death rate of 3/100ths of 1%. The other way of estimating rates of violent death in non-state societies comes from ethnographic vital statistics. The wave of state settlement that swept over the world, starting around 6,000 years ago, left a few pockets living in anarchy until recent times, and ethnographers who've lived with them over long spans of time have tallied their rates of death from various causes. Here I've put together 27 estimates of the rate of war death in all the non-state societies that I could find, and once again they span quite a range, but they average out at 524 war deaths per 100,000 population per year. That is, every year, 0.5% of the population dies in warfare. Let's compare that 524 figure to those of some particularly violent states in particularly violent periods. such as Germany in the 20th century with 2 world wars, which comes in at 144. Russia in the 20th century, which endured 2 world wars and a civil war at 135. Japan in the 20th century, which went through a world war that culminated in 2 nuclear strikes with a rate of 27. The United States in the 20th century, 2 world wars and half a dozen other foreign wars with a rate of 5.7. The world in the 20th century, again, aiming for the maximum credible estimate that sums the war deaths, deaths from genocide, and deaths from man-made famines, comes in at a rate of 60. And the world in the 21st century is represented by a bar that's less than 1 pixel high, with a death rate of 0.3 of a war death per 100,000 per year. So comparing the non-state societies with even the worst years of the state societies, we can conclude that when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. The immediate cause was the rise and expansion of states, leading to the various paxes that history students are taught, the Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Hispanica, and so on. It occurs because when states establish hegemony over a territory, they try to stamp out tribal raiding and feuding, not because they have a benevolent interest in the welfare of their citizens, but because tribal raiding and feuding are a nuisance to imperial overlords who would just as soon keep the people alive to supply them with taxes and soldiers and slaves. So just as a farmer has an incentive to prevent his livestock from killing each other, it's just a dead loss to him, so the first kings and emperors tried to stamp out tribal warfare, which from their point of view was a sheer loss. The second decline of violence can be appreciated by examining this woodcut showing a day in the life in the Middle Ages. And in a process called the civilizing process, this kind of mayhem was reduced. In many parts of Europe, including England, homicide statistics go back 800 years, and historical criminologists have plotted them over time, such as this graph, which spans from the year 1200 to the year 2000, and plots homicides on a logarithmic scale in terms of number of homicides per 100,000 population per year. And what is apparent from the graph is there has been a massive decline in the rate of homicide, such that a contemporary Englishman has 1/35 the chance of being murdered as his medieval ancestors. This is true not just in England, but in every European country for which data have been examined, such as Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland, and Scandinavia. Here I've plotted an average of those 5 regions, and for the sake of comparison, that 524 per 100,000 per year figure for non-state societies, this gap is what I call the pacification process. This further decline is I call the civilizing process.